I know you're still with us. I'd love for you to react to what the vice president just said.
Look, what the vice president said is what we've been hearing from President Trump and the administration since day one of Operation Epic Fury. The reason that the region is here is to ensure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon or a path to a program that would eventually allow them to create one or purchase one on the black market, for example. And this deal, according to the vice president, he says does that. And so the two key objectives that the Trump administration wanted to reach, the vice president says they've been reached: opening the Strait of Hormuz and ensuring that the Iranians are not going to have a path to a nuclear weapon. Again, when we step back here and we look at the damage caused to the Iranian regime, this is also significant because Iran's ballistic missile program threatened U.S. forces and allies across the Middle East. We saw that during the 40 days of Operation Epic Fury. And the fact that the United States and Israel took out many of the production lines belonging to the Iranians that created these ballistic missiles and these drones that were threatening allies and U.S. forces in the region, it makes the regime weaker. And it also gives the United States and Israel still the over-the-horizon capabilities, if something were to change in the future, to not only monitor the situation, but maintain a military posture in the Middle East. This is not what the Iranians wanted. Remember, what the Iranians wanted when they first entered into negotiations, they wanted to keep their highly enriched uranium. They wanted U.S. forces to leave all bases across the Middle East. And ultimately, they wanted control of the Strait of Hormuz. And so the Iranians did not get what they want out of this deal, but ultimately they got enough that they were willing to sign. And it's an indication that the Trump administration was able to create an agreement that the Iranians could stomach. And so the region now, again, is breathing a sigh of relief for the first time in more than 100 days after there was significant damage caused in the Middle East. And again, the hope here, as the vice president noted, is that this is going to usher in a new chapter for the Middle East. And we heard from President Trump about 2 weeks ago, and he called on regional countries in the Gulf that were working alongside the United States to work with Israel and normalize ties, the Abraham Accords, to join and ultimately do what the Emiratis have done, those in Bahrain, in Morocco, and create a situation where there is economic prosperity and opportunity and a focus on the future, not on the past that has often engulfed this region in death and destruction. And so, again, this is a new chapter for the region. When you look at a deal, signing a deal and implementing a deal are two very different things. But in terms of what the vice president had to say, it appears that the United States got everything they wanted at the negotiating table, and they are looking forward to what comes next in the region.
You know, Trey, we just heard there from the vice president. He laid out the three big points in his mind that are so significant here. Number one was the immediate reopening of the strait, plus the lifting of the U.S. naval blockade. Number three was emphasizing a point you had just been discussing about the contingent nature of the sanctions relief. The administration is calling this performance-based. That second one, though, to me, is the key one, which is Iran's nuclear program, and not just assurances from them that they won't seek a nuclear program in the future, but an actual verification regime within this deal that's embedded into it. When you think about interested parties in the region in particular, whether it's in Israel or some of the Gulf states, what are they going to be looking for in terms of concrete elements when it comes to verification? Because to me, that is a critical piece of this.
So there are two major things. One is ensuring that Iran doesn't have any remaining facilities where they would house advanced centrifuges that ultimately are part of that process to enrich uranium at a purer and purer form toward weapons-grade material. And the second would be to ensure that the enriched material that already exists inside of Iran, not just the highly enriched material at 60% purity, but all of the enriched material, is ultimately exported or destroyed and diluted inside of Iran. And if those two things are reached with the verification, not just of the United States, but of the International Atomic Energy Agency and other independent parties, then you have a situation where the region can rest assured that the Iranians are not working toward a nuclear weapon. And remember how close that they got before. They opened their negotiations before Operation Epic Fury began by telling U.S. negotiators they had enough highly enriched uranium to create 11 nuclear bombs. And as we saw during Operation Epic Fury, they have a ballistic missile program that can reach well beyond their borders, not just to Israel, but as far as Turkey, we saw during the war. and, of course, those Gulf countries. And so when you combine those two things, it's a very dangerous element for a country that is so unpredictable to have. And that is why that war and the operation during Epic Fury began. And it's why this negotiated settlement, according to the vice president, is going to ensure that the Iranians never have the ability to obtain a nuclear weapon. And the destruction, again, caused to the Iranian military, the production lines for the ballistic missiles and drones, and, of course, the destruction to the Navy is significant. And it certainly sets the Iranian regime back. And for Iran, when we think about their thought process in Tehran, that's why I told you they are going to release a lot of information and propaganda about what this deal means. They're going to focus on what it means for the Iranians because they have to sell the deal to their people. There are 90 million people in Iran. And remember how Iran became part of the conversation again this year. It started with demonstrations in late December and early January where these protesters were in the streets of Iranian cities and they were met with live ammunition. President Trump says around 42,000 Iranians were slaughtered in the streets of their country. And why were they in the streets? Because they were demonstrating against the economic situation inside of Iran. Iranian officials in the capital of Tehran were considering moving the capital city because they couldn't get fresh water to their own people. And so the domestic pressure and problems for the Iranian regime, they're just beginning. But as it relates to these external issues and this agreement with the United States of America, again, it appears that President Trump got exactly what he wanted, to ensure that Iran does not have a path to a nuclear weapon and to open the Strait of Hormuz.
Trey, you're on the ground there in Tel Aviv, and you've been covering Israel for the past several years now. What do you think the people of Israel will think about this deal? Will they trust it? I mean, these are people who are running into bomb shelters every other week for incoming bombs and missiles. What do you think they will think about this deal?
Yeah, it's a great question. And when we think about the Israeli people, they have lived the threat of the Iranian regime firsthand. And Iranian proxies like Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah. Hamas launched a brutal terrorist attack on October 7th of 2023 into southern Israel and slaughtered 1,200 Israelis. Hezbollah has routinely launched drones and rockets over the border into northern Israel and even central Israel, displacing tens of thousands of Israelis. The Houthis in Yemen have launched ballistic missiles and drones at this country, sending millions of people into bomb shelters. And of course, the Iranian regime has killed dozens of people. We saw it on the first day of Operation Epic Fury. About 10 minutes from where I'm standing, a ballistic missile slammed into an apartment block, killing someone. And the destruction was widespread. And so the Israelis understand this firsthand. And I can tell you, having talked to so many different Israeli officials, having interviewed Prime Minister Netanyahu during Operation Epic Fury, and constantly being in contact with sources here, they were never opposed to a deal. They were opposed to a bad deal. And ultimately, for Israel, a good deal will ensure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon. And so certainly they are interested in that verification process that the vice president talks about, because they want to make sure that Iran never has a path to a nuclear weapon, because Iran is a country who has both publicly and privately said they plan to destroy Israel. And so certainly there will be questions about the details of this agreement, but we will have to wait for the final document to be released.
Trey, if Israel and Hezbollah going at it almost stopped this deal from getting signed, President Trump has to get on the phone and say, stop, don't, to both. Don't respond, don't respond. This deal signed. We remove the blockade. Iran holds up their end on imposing tolls. We start to get rid of the mine countermeasures in the Strait. And something happens. Hezbollah fires rockets. Israel takes out a high-value target. I know Israel wants kind of a demilitarized zone in southern Lebanon. That's kind of their end goal, is to have an area there that makes them feel safer from Hezbollah. Do you feel like in this next, and we're going to say 60 days because that's what's kind of been reported, but we don't really know what this process looks like specifically. But if in 2 weeks something happens, do you feel like that's something that derails this, or do you feel like both sides, meaning the U.S. and Iran, understand that this is a deal between the U.S. and Iran, and that's secondary, tertiary actors that can't necessarily derail it once it's going down this path?
It's a good question, and if I learned anything covering the Middle East for the past 8 years, it's to not predict the future.
That's right.
Because we simply don't know.
Yeah.
And things change here very rapidly, and you can have a deal in place one day, and the next day there are missiles overhead. But as it relates to the situation today, we can analyze what happened earlier today. And there was a situation where after the Israelis were taking incoming drone and rocket attacks over the border, they responded with a strike against the Dahya neighborhood of southern Beirut. And this is a Hezbollah stronghold, and they killed a Hezbollah commander. And Iran had attached the situation between Hezbollah and Israel to the broader agreement with the United States. And then almost immediately we heard Iranian officials saying they are going to respond. Now, I talked to President Trump in between that time, and he told me, he said to Israel, stop striking Lebanon so that we can get this deal done. He told specifically the prime minister in a call that exact thing. But then he said he was going to get on the phone with the Iranians and ensure that they didn't launch missiles at Israel as to not derail this process. And that shows you just how delicate diplomacy can be on the battlefield, because one specific instance, one strike can change the entire equation. But clearly, according to Vice President Vance, President Trump, again, got directly involved and saved this agreement from derailing. And it's been signed now by both sides, and they're going to have this official signing ceremony in Switzerland later this week. But that's a specific example of something that can go wrong. If the Israelis come under attack, they say to Fox News they are going to reserve the right to respond. And if Hezbollah responds and the Iranians tie counterstrikes to the situation as it relates to this broader agreement, it certainly could be an issue. And so it's something we're going to watch in the days and weeks ahead. And again, it's impossible to predict the future here. We just don't know what it's going to look like. But we do know that the Israelis say they will maintain their ability to defend their country and ensure that their civilians who have been displaced from northern Israel can return to their homes.
Trey, kind of on that point, what does reneging or backing out of this deal look like for Iran in terms of our response to that? We know that this is going to be performance-based. Well, what if they don't live up to that performance? Does that mean that, in your estimation, that military action is back on the table? Do they go back to the negotiating table? I know that you don't have a crystal ball and you're not necessarily privy to all of those conversations, but from your perspective, we've seen Iran kind of renege on their end of the bargain a few times. So I'm wondering what that looks like.
Yeah, it's an important thing to look at here, because in any agreement, a deal can be violated. And if that takes place, we're told by U.S. officials that both the military option and diplomacy remain on the table as possible responses depending on what a violation would look like. But what the deal has done, and this is really important, how President Trump has structured this deal, he has made the deal contingent on Iran actually adhering to their end of the bargain. And so the Iranians are not going to get any sanctions relief unless they do what they say they're going to do. So if Iran threatens the Strait of Hormuz again, they're not going to get the sanctions relief. If they don't allow the process to take place as it relates to their nuclear program, they're not going to get the sanctions relief. And that's what they're after here. It's a lot of money, and it's a lot of money that they need because there are a variety of different things in terms of not just rebuilding their country, but also at one point during the war, there were reports that indicated they weren't able to even pay their own forces because of the economic situation inside of Iran. And so, again, they have to adhere to their end of the bargain in order to get anything in return. And so that is one reason that they would be incentivized to actually adhere to the agreement. Now, again, if they don't, and in the past they haven't, they have violated agreements in the past, there are both options, both diplomatic and military options of how the United States could respond. It's important to note here, again, the Iranians wanted U.S. forces to leave the entirety of the Middle East. And that's not part of this agreement. The Fifth Fleet in Bahrain will remain. U.S. forces at Al-Udeid base in Qatar will remain. And so we're talking still about thousands of U.S. service members who will stay in the Middle East because they're stationed here normally, even before this uptick in deployment for Operation Epic Fury. That hasn't changed. And again, this speaks to ultimately what the United States got at the negotiating table. Iran did not get what they wanted. And that's very important here because this gives the United States the ability to respond militarily in limited capacity where needed if they have to. They maintain the over-the-horizon capabilities to do so. And it's not just specifically as it relates to Iran, it's also the region. Because remember, the United States carried out airstrikes against the Houthis in Yemen because ultimately they were threatening U.S. ally Israel, and both the United States and Israel conducted airstrikes there against that Iranian proxy. There's another issue here, and it's a very long conversation, but it's an important thing to consider. This deal focuses on the Strait of Hormuz, and it focuses on Iran's nuclear program. In the past, the Iranians have threatened to use the Houthis to close Bab al-Mandab, which is the entrance to the Red Sea. It translates roughly to the gateway of tears. And if they do that, they would disrupt shipping in the Red Sea. And so, again, there are levers the Iranians still could pull, and they could try to use their proxies to disrupt things if they feel they're not getting what they want in these deeper negotiations. But again, when we zoom out here to what has taken place today, it is a moment of change in the region. And as the vice president noted, it's an opportunity for the Middle East to look forward and to not get so bogged down by a lot of the rhetoric that we saw, this back and forth and the threats that were taking place, but rather to look forward to a situation in the region where the Strait of Hormuz is open. The 20% of the world's global energy supply is moving once again through that critical waterway. The LNG, liquefied natural gas production from places like Qatar, can once again freely move out of the Persian Gulf. And Iran is negotiating in detail with the United States and international bodies like the IAEA to dismantle what remains of their nuclear program. And if all of that takes place, it is setting up a conversation in the Middle East that the region hasn't seen in 47 years since the Iranian regime came into power. And so, again, that is an optimistic view. Things will certainly go wrong. There will be bumps along the road. But this is where things stand today. There is a signing ceremony on Friday in Geneva, Switzerland. The vice president indicated that either he or President Trump, or possibly even both, will attend. And at this moment, the war is over. And the region will now look to stand up and look forward as to what comes next. And again, it would not be surprising to see President Trump once again urge these Gulf countries that came under Iranian attack to normalize ties with Israel, to join the Abraham Accords, because we actually saw during Operation Epic Fury, it came out later, it wasn't in real-time reporting, but we saw the important defense relationship between Israel and the UAE. And I think this is a representative example of what could come with other countries. The Israelis sent an Iron Dome air defense system to the UAE to help the Emiratis to shoot down incoming Iranian fire. And we have seen the United States help Israel to shoot down incoming fire with the deployment of Patriot and THAAD missile defense systems here, along, of course, with the Israeli Iron Dome, David Sling, and the Arrow 2 and 3 systems. But when we talk about air defense across the region, as we saw during the war, it is a joint effort. And that joint defense can encourage and incentivize these Gulf countries to normalize ties with Israel. And so, again, this is a different conversation that can be had in the region as a result of this deal being signed. And it allows the Middle East to look forward toward an opportunity that doesn't just bog the region down with death and destruction, but releases these ideas of opportunity and prosperity. Again, it's not clean. It will not be a simple task moving forward. This is not a perfectly optimistic view for the Middle East. And we've seen that a microcosm in Gaza. The process takes a very long time, and it's still not done there. But again, it allows a pause in the fighting. It allows things to de-escalate and these other conversations to take place. And again, at the negotiating table, President Trump got what he wanted. The Strait of Hormuz is open again, and we will likely see an increase in traffic in the days ahead. There will be a bit of a lag. These things often take a few days to actually go into effect, as the vice president noted. And then ultimately, these more detailed conversations as it relates to Iran's nuclear program and that enriched material, the highly enriched material that's also buried deep underground. And so there are a lot of moving parts and aspects here. And the United States will continue to work with regional partners like those in Islamabad and Pakistan, certainly the Qataris as well, that played a significant role in all of this, and these Gulf countries that still do have a say at the negotiating table, because the president has been able to build trust with these Gulf countries, and ultimately they see the value in having the relationship with the United States. And certainly you will hear rhetoric from the Iranian regime. We're already starting to get it in. I'm just looking at the wires here that are crossing from my producer here. Iran's deputy foreign minister says Iran's military power and threats helped in finalizing the text. You will hear more of this rhetoric from the Iranian regime. We talked about it. It is not surprising. The Iranians have to sell this deal to their people. But we have to look at the facts. We have to look at what is within the agreement. And according to the vice president, the United States got what they want out of this deal. And ultimately, U.S. forces are going to be able to pull back. Many of these service members eventually are going to be able to go home and be reunited with their loved ones as the United States celebrates 250 years. And it's a moment in time where, again, ultimately this region has an opportunity at a different path forward.
Certainly. It's an exciting time. Trey Yingst, please stay with us.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.